Ahoy! I am super excited about what's coming in the next patch. I was already talking about how I want the next patch to be very aggressive. I want sweeping changes that make balance overhauls across the board so that the game feels fresh, especially if we're not getting that much actual new content. And those changes are absolutely happening, possibly to a larger extent than I even expected. In the new Forged in Aeternum show, the devs talked about sweeping changes that will affect both PvP and PvE in a variety of ways, and I'm super excited for that. So let's get into the questions that were asked. The first one was why hot topics are often being addressed too late when players have already left the game that were complaining. They say that is obviously not their goal. They're always trying to get feedback from everywhere and trying to prioritize what is most important for most players. Some things also just take longer than others and can take months, so they don't want to promise things too early. They also have multiple weekly meetings, which also include devs that are very highly invested into actually playing the game. They're asked how they're dealing with botting. They say it is a complex issue and it requires the help of the tech team, telemetry to detect bots and scripts, but they also need to be careful not to ban players that have bot-like behavior when they're farming but aren't actually bots. They also think that the game is in a much better spot bot-wise than it was a year ago, and Scott said that he personally doesn't see bots nearly as often. And I have to say I agree with this. I often still hear people talking about massive bot issues, but I really don't see that many bots anymore. And being in AP Southeast, close to Asia, we definitely used to have a lot of bot problems. There are still bots, don't get me wrong, but not exponentially more than in other MMOs, for example. And now for a super exciting question. Somebody asked if there will be further rollback changes to the different armor types, so light, medium and heavy armor. The devs talked a little bit about past meta, saying how we kind of started with a heavy meta, but now we are, I quote, in a totally light meta. I don't quite agree with that, especially in wars we still see other weights being used, but generally yes, we are heavily towards the light side in most PvP and PvE modes, and on PTR they're aiming to make changes to that. They say light armor needs to be strong and needs to do a lot of damage, but currently still feels relatively safe, and their goal is to increase the risk for dealing that extra damage. And one way in which they intend to do that, which they want to try on PTR, is making things like Resilient or Shirking fortification less strong if you're wearing light armor. I think this is an extremely interesting approach. Survivability in light armor is usually higher because you have those long light rolls, so this basically goes in the same direction as the previous roll speed reduction after getting hit by melee attacks. The moment you get caught in light, you are in huge trouble. They didn't mention if this will also affect medium or if they're also intending to buff the stats on the heavy side or how exactly they're planning to balance this. So that's still to be determined, but it's definitely going to be very, very interesting how this will affect the meta once it is deployed. Of course, I will talk about that more once we have the patch notes details, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified. What will be particularly interesting is what this will mean for crit builds in PvP, because they might have more viability against light armor if Resilient can't be stacked as high. Also, it'll be interesting if this will affect ward perks as well and maybe have an impact on PvE too. But there are more changes. Another question was why there is no blue healing or oblivions for PvP and wars, and they announced that with the PTR we are going to get this as well. So we're gonna get heal circles that actually tell us that this is allied healing. I somewhat suspect that feature might have some issues in the beginning because it's going to be fairly difficult to extensively test on the PTR, but we'll see about that. The next question was about PvP plans for this year because the roadmap seems extremely PvE centric. They are clearly stating that the direction for the game is not, we are just a PvE game. PvP is still important to them. AGS has significant work in 2023 going toward PvP, but not all of it is on the roadmap. They will tell us more info about that in about a month. I would primarily suspect this to be the changes to declaring war on a territory and the territory control, because that's what they kind of been talking about on and off already. Additionally, they also said that the combat balance changes will dramatically affect PvP, and I agree with that. And I think balance changes in PvE can freshen up the game even if it's otherwise kind of the same. Like, arena will still be the same arena, but if other armor weights and weapons are suddenly used, it will still feel different. The next question was if there will be any Musket and Greatsword changes. The Musket is, I quote, in their sights. They tried to take action with the damage fall-off in December, but they did not achieve the result they wanted, and they're aware of that. As I talked about it before, the fall-off itself wasn't as much as planned, especially because the int fall-off wasn't even affected at all. The inside of it doesn't have fall-off. They're aiming to do more drastic measures in the upcoming PTR. On one hand, they want to tackle the accuracy of the musket. They say you may need to be more stationary to hit shots. Imagine one option here could be a noticeable weapon sway, something that many shooter games have for snipers, where you have to stay still in one place for a while or maybe even lay down to have less of that sway. Maybe the accuracy perk itself may also gain value through this by stabilizing the weapon faster. This could effectively also end up nerfing the musket if accuracy becomes pretty much mandatory and you have to drop another damaging perk from your weapon in order to get it. The other nerf they're planning to do is a nerf to the Mortal Empowerment perk. This is probably not a surprise to anyone who has ever read the perk, because Mortal Empowerment is just extremely effective on the musket due to the musket's higher safety, so the risk with this weapon is much lower than with others. As I said before, I hope we're seeing some buffs to the Trapper tree in the future, so that's a more appealing option and a more close-range musket as possible. IGS actually forgot to address the Greatsword in the interview in the question, but they already mentioned the Greatsword in the forum post a few days ago, so we are likely going to see changes to the Greatsword in some form as well, and I would expect there will be nerfs. The next question was a bit random. It was how to best contact support. The answer was, for feedback, use the forums; for problems that are like in the game, use the in-game report system; and otherwise for tech issues, contact the support. Next, AGS was asked when we can expect more revamps of zones in the future. The goal is to have the level 1 to 60 experience until the end of the Tempest storyline overhauled by the end of the year. This sounds fairly hectic and optimistic. However, they did say they may not hit all the zones while doing this overhaul. They're primarily focused on the main quest, so maybe Morning Day will have to wait a little bit. We do know from previous interviews that they're already working on the next zones, but also don't think that all zones need the same degree of overhaul. They primarily wanted to especially overhaul the early zones because they are all so similar. Somebody asked if we would see a revamp to the portal rewards outside of them providing shards and gypsum. The devs are planning to make breaches feel more like an event. They want to reduce the frequency and amount of these spawning portals, but then increase the reward in return. I believe this is a very good approach that will make portals more interesting and more hype. If you see one spawn ever so often and you know that it's actually worth going there, you might just head over for the rewards. In regards to balance, one of the questions was if there will be separate weapon stats for PvP and PvE to balance them better against each other. AGS' plan is to balance PvE and PvP through other things, like for example Resilient, perks that are already exclusive to PvP and to PvE. And one of those changes is going to happen on PTR, which is making Bane for ranged weapons more powerful, so Ancient Bane, Angry Earth Bane and so on. This I think is very, very exciting, and in addition to that, in combination with that, they're also going to remove the elemental resistance from mutations, so you can use your preferred weapon in your preferred mutation much easier. There will still be the advantages, the elemental types that are stronger against certain mobs, but no longer any disadvantages through mutations. So you can now run a Void Gauntlet in Void Week. The big question is what this will mean for mixed weapons, like for example the Hatchet or the Void Gauntlet, which can technically be used as melee or as ranged weapons. Sadly, there is a chance that the Throwing Hatchet will just be vastly outclassed by just using a bow instead, for example. A very random question was if there will be hippos in Aeternum in 2023. The answer here was a clear no, but they'd like to have them at some point in the future, just not this year. However, they said they are more inclined for something of the simian family. That means monkeys or apes. Since we know that the next major piece of content, which is likely coming towards the end of the year, similar to Brimstone, will be Angry Earth themed, I could see monkeys fitting in quite well there with a jungle-esque theme. I would absolutely love to see a more tropical theme at New World, and it would kind of make sense if you go north of the desert, so to me that would be extremely cool. We will likely learn more about the PvP and PvE changes later this week, where I'm expecting a forum post about the PTR changes. When that comes out, I will of course talk about it here, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to see that. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.